Keisha Monroe has worked as a head chef at Elegance, the city's most exclusive restaurant, for 7 years. She built her reputation on excellence, respect, and an unspoken rule: stay invisible, stay employed. But when the restaurant's new owner, Richard Ashford, a real estate mogul with political connections, begins systematically harassing staff and embezzling from the business, Keisha faces an impossible choice. She can remain silent like everyone else, or she can speak the truth and lose everything. When she confronts Ashford about his corruption and the missing funds meant for employee benefits, he doesn't just fire her. He blacklists her across the city's entire hospitality industry. Within 48 hours, Keisha is unemployed, broke, and facing eviction. Her single mother depends on her income. Her younger brother is in college on a scholarship she helped secure. But Keisha doesn't know that Marcus "Ghost" Rivera, a black biker who ate at Elegance every Friday night and watched her work with quiet admiration, made a promise to himself years ago to stand with people who stood for what's right. When he hears what happened, Ghost doesn't hesitate. He makes one phone call. Within hours, 73 bikers from 3 different crews roll through the city. What happens next becomes a national moment. A convoy of leather and steel defending a woman's honor, exposing Ashford's crimes, and reminding the world that loyalty still means something. This is a story about keeping promises to strangers, about the family you choose, and about what happens when the voiceless find their voice, and the bikers who ride beside them. The kitchen at Elegance smelled like truffle oil and brass polish, the kind of place where every plate was a performance and every mistake was a funeral. Keisha Monroe had memorized this smell 7 years ago, the first day she walked through the service entrance at 5:47 a.m., her chef's whites still stiff from the package, her hands steady, even though her mother was 3 months behind on rent. 7 years, 2,555 days, and she'd never been late, never burned a sauce, never let a plate leave her station unless it was perfect. The private dining room was full tonight, 20 seats. Richard Ashford was hosting his real estate associates, men in suits that cost more than Keisha's car, women in jewelry that caught the light like weapons. Ashford had bought Elegance 6 months ago, after the previous owner retired. He'd promised to elevate the brand, which meant firing half the original staff, cutting corners on ingredients, and turning the restaurant into a place where power was served on porcelain. Keisha had stayed. She'd always stayed. "Chef," called Marcus from the pass, his voice tight. "Table 7 is sending back the sea base, says it's overcooked." It wasn't. Keisha knew her temperatures like she knew her own pulse, 42 degrees Celsius, perfectly seared, but she didn't argue. She plated a new one in 7 minutes, faster than the first, and sent it out with a silent prayer. Click now to watch what happens next. 10 minutes later, Marcus returned. "He wants to see you." Ashford stood in his office, a space that used to belong to the executive chef, now converted into a monument to his own importance. Floor-to-ceiling windows, views of the city, and photographs of himself on every wall. Ashford cutting ribbons, Ashford shaking hands with politicians, Ashford smiling with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Keisha," he said, not looking up from his computer, "your food is adequate. But adequacy doesn't cut it anymore." She didn't speak. Speaking was dangerous. "I've been reviewing the accounts," he continued, turning to face her now. His teeth were too white, his hair too dark for his age. "Do you know how much we spend on premium ingredients every month?" "Whatever maintains our standards, sir." He laughed, a sound like gravel in a disposal. "Standards. You know what standards are? They're excuses for mediocrity. We're cutting costs, new suppliers, frozen stock where possible. Your job is to make it taste like it's fresh." The word frozen hung in the air like smoke. Keisha had worked under 3 executive chefs before Ashford. She'd trained in New Orleans, apprenticed in Charleston, spent her own money on certifications and techniques. She'd built something here, not just meals, integrity, the kind that didn't come from corners cut. "Mr. Ashford," she said carefully, "our reputation is built on—" "Your reputation," he interrupted, standing now, "is built on my investment, and my investment needs to be profitable." He walked to the window. The city at night was beautiful from up here, all those lives happening below, none of them knowing what was being decided in this office. "I've also noticed," Ashford said, his voice now casual in a way that made her stomach tighten, "that you've been very friendly with some of the staff, especially the younger ones, encouraging them to unionize, I hear, spreading discontent about wages." Keisha's breath caught. She hadn't organized anything formal, but yes, she'd talked to people. She'd mentioned that the new health insurance plan was worse, that the raises Ashford promised when he arrived had never materialized, that the money set aside for employee benefits seemed to have vanished. "I help people when they have questions," Keisha said. "You meddle," Ashford corrected. "And meddling costs money. It costs productivity. It costs me." He returned to his desk, opened a file, her file, and slid it across the mahogany surface toward her. The termination papers were already signed. "You're fired," he said, "effective immediately. Security will escort you out. And, Keisha, I'd be very careful about what you say to other restaurants. This industry is small. People talk, especially about troublemakers." The room tilted. 7 years, 2,555 days, and it ended in 6 seconds. Keisha picked up the papers with hands that didn't shake. A discipline earned through a lifetime of staying composed when the world wanted her to break. She walked to the door, then paused. "The money," she said quietly, not turning around. "The Employee Benefits Fund. It's missing. I have the receipts. The Board of Health has questions. So does the IRS." She heard him stand, heard the anger rising in his throat like something with teeth. "Get out!" But as she walked down the service stairs, past the kitchen where Marcus's face fell the moment he saw the papers in her hand, past the dining room where her food was being praised by men who didn't know the woman who'd prepared it had just lost her livelihood, Keisha Monroe made a silent vow. She would not disappear quietly. The truth was coming, even if no one was listening yet. Marcus Ghost Rivera sat at his usual table every Friday night at 7 p.m., table 7 by the window, far enough from the kitchen that Keisha wouldn't feel watched, but close enough that he could see her work. He'd been coming to Elegance for 3 years, long before Ashford arrived, and in all that time, he'd never ordered anything she didn't prepare. Ghost was 52 years old, built like a structure designed to last. Broad shoulders that still carried the muscle of his military days, dark skin lined with experience, and eyes that had seen things most people prayed they'd never see. He was a Vietnam vet, a black biker who'd founded his crew, the Iron Promises, in 1987, and a man who believed that loyalty was the only currency that actually meant something. He didn't know Keisha beyond her name and the way she moved through the kitchen, efficient, purposeful, proud. But he recognized something in her, the same thing he saw in himself, a person who'd built something on honor in a world that didn't always respect it. Tonight was Thursday. Ghost got the call from Marcus, the sous chef, at 11:34 p.m. They knew each other from the community center, where Ghost volunteered mentoring kids from the neighborhood. Good man, Marcus. Quiet, trustworthy. "She's gone," Marcus said without preamble. "Keisha. Ashford fired her today, said she was causing trouble, organizing people. But Ghost—" Marcus's voice dropped. "I know the real reason. She found out about the money." Ghost was sitting in the garage of his clubhouse, working on a carburetor. He set down his tools slowly. "What money?" "The Employee Benefits Fund. Thousands of dollars. Keisha kept the books organized. Wasn't her job, but she did it anyway. Noticed discrepancies about 2 months ago, started asking questions quietly, never made a scene. But Ashford figured it out. And he fired her to shut her up, Ghost finished. Yeah, and he threatened her, said she'd never work in this city again if she talked. Ghost's jaw tightened. He'd heard that song before, different verses, same melody. Rich man crushing someone smaller. Silence bought with fear, justice delayed, then forgotten. Where is she? Ghost asked. Probably home. She lives in the Riverside Apartments, Building C, 3rd floor. But Ghost, don't do anything crazy. She's a good person. She doesn't need trouble. Ghost smiled without warmth. Sometimes good people need witnesses, not troublemakers. Witnesses. He hung up and sat in the darkness of the garage, listening to the sound of motorcycles being worked on in the shop bays beyond. The Iron Promises had chapters in 4 states, 73 members active, all of them bound by the same code. You stand for people who stand for what's right. Ghost had made that promise in 1987 when he founded the crew. He'd kept it for 38 years. He walked into the main clubhouse where 3 of his officers were playing cards. Dane, his vice president, a Navajo man with a presence that filled rooms. Lucia, his treasurer, a woman built like a hurricane and twice as dangerous. And James, communications, the person who held the network together. I need to call a ride, Ghost said. They didn't ask questions. They knew that tone. Within an hour, word had spread through the network. By 2 a.m., messages were coming in from other chapters. The Iron Promises had brothers in 3 other states, the Leather Kings, the Desert Riders, the Brotherhood, all of them connected through Ghost's promise, through a philosophy that had been tested 1,000 times and never broken. Loyalty means something. Honor means something. Standing with the voiceless means everything. By dawn, 73 bikers had committed to the ride. Ghost sat on his bike, a 1978 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, black as midnight, with chrome that caught the sun like silver fire, and thought about promises. Not the kind you make with words, the kind you make with your life, the kind you keep even when it costs. He'd promised decades ago that he would be the person he'd needed when he was powerless. He'd been a black man in a white-run military. He'd been poor, he'd been voiceless, he'd been afraid. The Iron Promises existed so that nobody had to be afraid alone. He fired up the engine. The sound was raw, ancient, true. Behind him, the others were doing the same, bikes coming to life, a chorus of steel and thunder. 73 engines, 73 riders ready to roll. By the time the sun broke across the city, Keisha Monroe wouldn't know what was coming, but the city would remember. Keisha's apartment was small, a 1-bedroom in Riverside Apartments, Building C, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's arguments, and the heat only worked on Tuesdays. She'd moved here 5 years ago after her divorce, with nothing but her chef's knives and a determination to never need a man again. She was sitting at her kitchen table at 5:47 a.m., drinking cold coffee and staring at the termination papers, when her phone rang. Unknown number. Ms. Monroe? A woman's voice, professional, tired. This is Detective Sarah Chen with the city's Fraud Investigation Unit. We've received a formal complaint regarding financial irregularities at Elegance Restaurant. We'd like to schedule an interview with you at your earliest convenience. Keisha's hand shook as she took down the information. 3 hours later, after speaking with Detective Chen and providing documentation, receipts, spreadsheets, screenshots, she felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but the first tiny crack in the darkness. Her phone buzzed. Text from her mother. "Baby, I heard about Elegance. Come to the house. We'll figure this out." Her phone rang again. Another restaurant, a boutique catering company, asking if she was available for contract work. Word traveled fast, not all of it bad. By 9 a.m., Keisha had made 3 other calls, other chefs she'd trained under, colleagues from her early days in the industry. All of them remembered her, all of them willing to help. Maybe Ashford's threat was hollow. Maybe this city still knew what integrity meant. She was in the shower at 10:30 a.m., letting hot water run over her shoulders when she heard the sound, distant at first, like thunder, then closer, growing, becoming not a sound, but a presence, a vibration in the walls, a rumble that made the entire building shake. The shower tiles rattled. The mirror in the medicine cabinet trembled. Motorcycles, dozens of them. Keisha wrapped herself in a towel and went to the window. Below, in the parking lot of Riverside Apartments, bikers were arriving. Not just a few, a convoy, black leather and chrome. Bike after bike pulling in and parking in perfect formation, men and women, different ages, different backgrounds, all of them moving with purpose. She counted, stopped counting after 40. A knock at her door, firm, respectful. "Ms. Monroe?" A man's voice, deep and steady. "My name is Marcus Ghost Rivera. I'm president of the Iron Promises Motorcycle Club. I'm here with a few friends. Can we talk?" Keisha opened the door to find a black man in his 50s, wearing a kuta covered in patches, the colors of the Iron Promises, the insignia of his rank, symbols of loyalty earned over decades. Behind him, standing in the hallway, were at least a dozen other bikers. Behind them, more. The stairwell was packed. "What is this?" Keisha asked, her voice small. "This," Ghost said quietly, "is what happens when someone stands for what's right and nobody tells them they're standing alone." He showed her his phone. A video, already uploaded to social media. 73 bikers, their engines running, lined up in formation outside Elegance Restaurant. The caption read, "She was fired for speaking the truth. We ride for her." The video had been posted 6 hours ago. It had 847,000 views. The comments were a flood. "This is what real brotherhood looks like. She stood alone, so we ride together. Stand up against corruption. These bikers get it." Screenshots were spreading across every platform. News outlets were already picking it up. By noon, 3 local stations had the story. By 1 p.m., national media was calling. "I don't understand," Keisha whispered. "You spoke the truth," Ghost said simply. "You did it alone. You lost everything. But you didn't break. That's rare. That's worth standing for." He gestured down the hallway. "The Iron Promises are here. So are the Leather Kings, the Desert Riders, the Brotherhood. 73 of us. We're not leaving until you're protected, until the police investigate fully, until Ashford's corruption is public, and until you have a job lined up, a future secured, and the knowledge that you never stand alone again." Keisha's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of something she'd thought had died years ago. Recognition, witness, the knowledge that her courage had been seen. "Come on," Ghost said, extending his hand. "Get dressed. We've got press waiting downstairs. And Keisha, you're going to tell them everything. No more silence, no more shame, just truth. And now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. By the time Keisha walked downstairs with Ghost, there were already news crews in the parking lot, 4 vans, reporters setting up tripods, cameras with red lights blinking. The bikers had created a perimeter, organized, protective, intimidating in their silent solidarity. Ghost had called ahead to James, the Iron Promises communications officer. James was a former journalist, educated and articulate, and he'd prepared a statement. The media presence was coordinated, strategic, professional. "The narrative matters," Ghost had told Keisha upstairs. "Right now the narrative is Ambitious young black woman stood up to corrupt millionaire and got fired for it. That's the story we're telling. That's the truth we're protecting. Keisha stood on the small patch of grass in front of Building C, Ghost on one side, Lucia on the other. Behind them, 73 bikers stood in silent witness. The sun was bright. The day was cold. Her voice was steady. She recounted everything. The 7 years of excellence. The way Ashford cut corners on ingredients to boost profits. The missing employee benefits fund, nearly $340. And Duro's zero that had disappeared into shell accounts. The spreadsheets she'd documented. The threats he'd made. The calculated destruction of her career to silence her. "I wasn't organizing a rebellion," Keisha said into the cameras, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "I was asking questions. I was trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. And when I did, I was told I'd never work in this city again." She gestured to the bikers behind her. "But I was never alone. I just didn't know it yet." The reporters shouted questions, but Ghost had orchestrated this carefully. No time for hostile queries. Instead, Detective Chen appeared, the fraud investigator who'd called Keisha that morning. She confirmed that a formal investigation into Elegance's finances was underway, that evidence of embezzlement had been secured, that an arrest warrant for Richard Ashford was being processed that afternoon. The story shifted in real time. By 2 p.m., Ashford was in custody. By 3 p.m., his attorney was demanding bail. By 4 p.m., the news had spread to the business community. 7 other employees at Elegance came forward with their own stories of manipulation and theft. The web of corruption was larger than anyone had realized. That evening, Keisha was offered 3 different head chef positions, all at restaurants that understood the value of her integrity. She chose Sage, a farm-to-table establishment owned by a woman named Dr. Anita Okafor, a former medical doctor who'd left medicine to build something she believed in. They shook hands in Dr. Okafor's office while Ghost waited in the lobby. "You're hired," Dr. Okafor said simply. "Starting salary, 30% more than Elegance, full benefits, profit sharing, and complete autonomy over your menu. I don't buy your talent, Ms. Monroe. I buy your vision. I buy your integrity. I buy your courage." When Keisha walked out, Ghost was reading a magazine. He looked up and smiled. "You good?" "I'm employed," Keisha said. "I have a contract. I have security." "That's not what I asked," Ghost said, standing. "I asked if you're good." Keisha thought about the question. She thought about 7 years of silence, of swallowing her voice to stay invisible. She thought about the risk she'd taken by speaking truth. She thought about the 73 bikers who'd ridden for her. "Yeah," she said finally. "I'm good." Ghost nodded and walked her to the door. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. The bikes were still there. The bikers were still waiting. "They're going to stay through the weekend," Ghost said. "Make sure you're safe. Make sure Ashford's people know there's a cost to revenge. By Monday, most of us will head out, but you've got family now. You call, we ride. That's the promise." He extended his hand. She shook it, firm, certain, true. That night, for the first time in years, Keisha slept without fear. Richard Ashford's arrest didn't humble him. It made him dangerous. From the county detention facility, using phone privileges and his attorney's resources, he began a counter-offensive. He hired a high-powered defense team, the kind that costs 7 figures and knows every loophole in the legal system. He filed motions claiming evidence was improperly obtained. He attempted to discredit Detective Chen's investigation, and most troubling, he began making threats. Keisha received the first one on Sunday morning, a voicemail from an unknown number. "You've destroyed a good man's life with lies. You'll pay for that. Everyone you love will pay." She played it for Ghost without hesitation. His response was immediate. He called a meeting of the Iron Promises officers and the representatives from the other 3 clubs. 23 bikers in the Promises clubhouse, around a table scarred with decades of decisions and loyalty. "Ashford's scared," Ghost told them. "Scared people become unpredictable. Keisha needs protection, but not the kind that looks like protection. Keisha needs her life back. Needs to go to work, walk to the store, exist without fear. That means Ashford needs to understand that the cost of touching her is higher than his money can buy." Lucia spoke first. "We could intercept any attempt, keep eyes on her." "No," Ghost said. "That's reactive. We need to be strategic." James, the communications officer, leaned forward. "What if we make the story bigger than him? What if we don't make this about Keisha versus Ashford? We make it about corruption in the restaurant industry. We expose everything. We bring in the Labor Board, the IRS, the State Attorney General's office." The room nodded. This was better. This was the kind of leverage that didn't require violence, just truth amplified. Over the next week, Ghost orchestrated something larger than a legal defense. He worked with journalists, with labor advocates, with investigators from multiple agencies. He ensured that Keisha's case became part of a broader narrative, the hidden crisis of exploitation in fine dining. Other victims came forward, other restaurants, other chefs, servers, bartenders, all of them with stories of manipulation, wage theft, and systematic abuse. Ashford's crimes were suddenly not an isolated incident. They were a symptom of a larger disease. The media coverage shifted from fired chef vindicated by bikers to multi-restaurant fraud ring exposed. The scope widened. The danger to Ashford multiplied. By Wednesday, the State Attorney General's office had launched a formal investigation into 15 restaurants across the city. Ashford's assets were frozen. His attorneys realized they were defending not just one case, but potentially a dozen interconnected fraud schemes. His bail was revoked. He was remanded into custody without bond. But Ghost knew something that most people didn't. Wealthy men in custody don't disappear quietly. They contact people. They make arrangements. They find ways to cause damage from behind bars. So Ghost did something that surprised everyone. He called a press conference of his own. 73 bikers assembled at sunrise on the steps of City Hall. Keisha standing beside Ghost, her arm linked through his, not as a romantic gesture, but as a declaration of family. "This isn't about one man anymore," Ghost told the gathered press. "This is about a system that allows corruption to flourish because people are too afraid to speak. We ride for people who stand for what's right. We stand as witnesses to their courage, and we won't stop until the entire system is exposed and reformed." He announced that the Iron Promises, in collaboration with the other clubs, were launching an initiative to support restaurant workers, hospitality workers, anyone facing exploitation, legal aid, financial support, protection. The message was clear. Ashford had tried to silence one voice, and instead he'd awakened 73 voices. And those voices weren't going away. That afternoon, Ashford's attorney filed a motion for early trial, desperate to move forward before the scandal deepened further. But the damage was done. Keisha worked her first shift at Sage that Friday night. Ghost sat at the bar and watched as she moved through the kitchen with the same grace and excellence she'd always possessed, but now without fear. Every plate that left her station was perfect, not because she was afraid of consequence, but because she was proud of her work, because she was free. The meal was extraordinary. Ghost ate slowly, savoring every bite, understanding what he was tasting. A woman's dignity returned. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Detective Chen presented evidence methodically, spreadsheets, wire transfers, encrypted messages between Ashford and his financial advisors. Keisha testified with absolute clarity, her memory precise, her facts unassailable. Other victims testified, former employees, victims of wage theft, witnesses to humiliation and corruption. Ashford's defense was predictable. He claimed he was being framed, that evidence had been manipulated, that a conspiracy of environmentalists and anti-business activists were targeting him for political reasons. His attorneys were skilled, but they couldn't overcome the mountains of documentary evidence. Ghost attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row. So did representatives from the other clubs, subtle presence, silent witness. A reminder that the world was watching. On the morning of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, victims, community members and bikers. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned with a verdict. Guilty. All 13 counts. Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy and threatening a witness. The judge sentenced Ashford to 12 years in federal prison. Keisha didn't celebrate. She simply nodded, as if something she'd always known had finally been confirmed. Justice wasn't about triumph, it was about accountability. It was about the universe occasionally aligning with truth. That evening, Ghost took Keisha to the Iron Promises clubhouse. It was an old warehouse converted into a sanctuary, motorcycles being worked on, pool tables worn smooth by decades of use, walls covered with photographs spanning nearly 40 years. Every person in those photographs had a story of loyalty, of standing with the voiceless. "This is your family now," Ghost said simply. "Not just me, all of them." Lucia greeted her with a hug that nearly broke her ribs. James offered to help her with anything she needed. Dane introduced her to his wife, his children, his entire extended family. The message was clear. Keisha had passed from isolated individual into a network of belonging. Ghost walked her outside as the evening turned to night. The city glittered below them, lights spreading out like promises. "You did good," Ghost said. "You stood alone when it counted. You didn't break. You didn't disappear." "I had you," Keisha said. "No," Ghost corrected gently. "You stood first. We showed up because you stood. That's the order that matters." He walked her to her car, a beat-up Honda she'd owned for 6 years, reliable and honest. "The promise we make," Ghost said, "is that you never stand alone again. Not because you need protection, but because you've earned the kind of respect that draws loyalty. You understand. This isn't charity. This isn't debt. This is recognition. This is family." Keisha drove home as the city lights blurred past, understanding for the first time that standing for what's right doesn't end in isolation. It ends in community. It ends in belonging. 2 weeks later, she received a promotion at Sage, executive chef, full autonomy, her name on the menu alongside Dr. Okafor's vision. A month later, she helped launch an initiative with Ghost and the clubs, Voices Heard, a non-profit supporting hospitality workers facing exploitation. By the end of the year, 17 restaurants had been investigated. 8 more executives were facing charges. Wages that had been stolen were recovered and returned to workers. One black woman had stood up to a rich man. 73 bikers had answered the call, and a city had changed. Like and comment. Did Ashford deserve what he got? And what do you think happens next in Keisha's story? Subscribe for more stories of courage and loyalty. Spring had arrived early, painting the city in soft greens and morning light. Keisha stood in the kitchen of Sage, reviewing orders for the evening service. Dr. Okafor was out of town for a conference, leaving the entire operation in Keisha's hands, exactly as she'd promised on the day she hired her. 6 months since Ashford's conviction. 6 months since the verdict. 6 months since Keisha's life had reorganized itself around a principle she'd always believed but never fully trusted. That doing the right thing, even alone, even at cost, eventually creates the conditions for alliance. The Iron Promises had kept their promise. Ghost showed up at Sage once a month. always to table 7, always with appetites for her food and ears open for her concerns. Lucia had become something like a friend, helping Keisha navigate legal paperwork for the Voices Heard initiative. James had worked with her to build a media strategy that wasn't about defending herself, but about protecting other workers. The organization they'd built together was now operating in 4 states. They'd helped 347 workers recover nearly $3 million in stolen wages. They'd connected 89 workers with attorneys. They'd documented and exposed corruption in 18 restaurants and hospitality operations, 1 black woman, 73 bikers, 1 choice to stand. What had grown from that was something larger than any of them had anticipated. This morning, Keisha had received a call from the Department of Labor. They wanted to hire her as a consultant, a position that would pay her $95 and $0 annually to help develop training programs for workers, to identify exploitation patterns, to build systems of protection and accountability. It was an opportunity to leave the kitchen, to move into policy work, to change systems instead of just feeding people. Keisha stood there in the quiet of the early morning kitchen, thinking about her hands that had spent 20 years perfecting the science of heat and timing, of transformation through fire. Those hands had learned how to turn ingredients into nourishment, but they could also learn how to turn observation into protection, investigation into justice. She called Ghost. "Come to Sage tonight," she said. "I need to talk to you and the crew about something." That evening, Ghost arrived with Lucia, Dane, and James. Keisha closed the restaurant early and prepared a meal, not as a chef, but as a woman celebrating something with people who mattered. They sat around one of the dining tables, and Keisha explained the opportunity. "It means I'd be stepping away from full-time work here," she said. "I'd still consult with Dr. Okafor, still maintain my relationship with Sage, but my primary work would shift to Voices Heard and the Department of Labor contract." "That's good," Ghost said simply. "That's exactly what we hoped for. You standing in systems now, making change from the inside." "But it also means I'd be less visible," Keisha continued, "less available for community events, for the work in the restaurants." "No, it doesn't," Lucia said. "It means you're more powerful. You're not just helping people. You're changing policy. You're building protections that will help workers we haven't even met yet." They ate slowly, talking about the future, about what Voices Heard could become with Keisha at the helm, about the systems that needed dismantling, the protections that needed building. By the end of the evening, the decision was clear. Keisha would take the position. She would remain connected to Sage, but her primary work would shift toward systemic change. "This is what keeps the promise alive," Ghost said as they left. "Not just defending individuals, building systems that protect the voiceless before they need defending." Keisha stood in the empty restaurant after they'd gone, surrounded by the kitchen she'd built into something beautiful. She thought about promises, about the way one person's courage creates conditions for alliance, about how standing alone, when it matters, can eventually transform into standing with. She thought about Ashford, sitting in a federal prison cell, understanding finally that some victories can't be purchased with money, that some people can't be silenced with fear. And she thought about Ghost, a man she'd never known 6 months ago, who'd chosen to witness her courage and amplify it into something the entire city had to reckon with. That was the promise that mattered, not the promise to protect, but the promise to witness. The promise to see someone standing for what's right and say, "I see you, you're not alone, we ride together." The hearing before the Senate Committee on Labor and Workforce Development was held in a room designed to intimidate. High ceilings, polished mahogany, senators sitting behind an elevated dais, looking down at witnesses like gods examining mortals. Keisha sat at the witness table on a Tuesday morning in May, with Ghost and Lucia sitting in the gallery behind her, permitted as representatives of the Iron Promises organization. She wore a black blazer over a white blouse, her hair in braids, her posture perfect, steady, unmoved. The committee chairman, Senator Rothschild, a white man in his 70s from a conservative state, opened with a hostile question. "Ms. Monroe, you're here to testify about alleged labor violations in the hospitality industry, but I'm concerned this hearing is being weaponized against business owners. How many of the allegations you've made have actually resulted in criminal convictions?" Keisha didn't hesitate. 17 convictions so far, Senator. 17 cases of documented wage theft, systematic fraud, and exploitation. Each of those cases involved workers, overwhelmingly women and people of color, who had their labor stolen. In each case, business owners or managers deliberately concealed income, manipulated records, or intimidated workers into silence. Those are facts, convictions, not allegations. She pulled out a folder. "I've brought documentation, victim testimonies, surveillance footage, financial records. Every conviction is supported by evidence that a reasonable person would find compelling." Senator Rothschild shifted uncomfortably. Over the next 2 hours, Keisha testified about patterns, about how exploitation wasn't random accident, but systematic design. About how workers, especially black women, immigrants, people with limited English proficiency, were targeted specifically because they were less likely to report abuse. About how the hospitality industry had become a training ground for criminals who understood they could exploit vulnerable people with near-complete impunity. She talked about her own case, about standing alone against Ashford, about the cost it had nearly destroyed her, about how only external pressure and documentation had protected her. And then she talked about the 73 bikers who'd shown up. "They weren't there because I was special," Keisha testified. "They were there because they recognized something important, that courage, when it's isolated, gets crushed, but courage, when it's witnessed and amplified, becomes power." Those 73 bikers understood something that our legal system sometimes forgets. Solidarity matters, community matters, standing with the voiceless matters. Senator Carlson, a younger woman from a progressive state, leaned forward. "Ms. Monroe, what would you suggest to protect workers in the future? What policies would prevent what happened to you from happening to others?" Keisha outlined a comprehensive proposal: mandatory workplace protections, salary transparency, third-party audit requirements for hospitality businesses, protected whistleblower status, legal aid for workers filing complaints, community oversight boards with representation from workers and advocacy organizations. In short, Senator, we need to make exploitation more difficult than compliance. Right now, the math works for owners. Cheat, maybe get caught, face penalties that amount to a small percentage of profits. We need to flip that equation. We need worker protection to be woven into the fabric of how businesses operate. The hearing concluded. Keisha was escorted out of the chamber by Capitol Police, Ghost and Lucia following. In the hallway outside, reporters surrounded them. "Ms. Monroe, do you think Congress will act on your testimony? What's next for Voices Heard? How did a motorcycle club become involved in labor advocacy?" Ghost stepped forward before Keisha could respond. "My name is Marcus Rivera. I'm president of the Iron Promises Motorcycle Club. We became involved because a black woman stood up for what was right, and we believed that deserved to be witnessed. We're not labor advocates. We're not experts in policy. We're just people who understand that loyalty means something, that community means something. If what happened to Keisha Monroe had happened to someone else, we would have been there for them too. Because that's the promise we made a long time ago. Nobody stands alone." The image was captured. Ghost in his kuta and colors, Lucia beside him, Keisha between them, speaking truth to power. And it spread across social media with the caption, "When bikers became labor advocates." 3 weeks later, Senator Carlson introduced the Workplace Accountability and Worker Advocacy Act, WAWA, legislation that incorporated nearly all of Keisha's recommendations. It didn't pass that session, but it was introduced. It became part of the national conversation. It created conditions for change. Ghost told Keisha something important that evening, sitting in the parking lot of her apartment building. "You stood alone. Then you stood with us. Now you're standing for thousands of people you'll never meet. That's how change happens. One person, then community, then systems. All of it connected." Keisha understood what he was saying. The promise wasn't just about protecting one person. It was about creating structures where the voiceless could speak, where courage could be witnessed, where solidarity could transform into policy. 1 year after Keisha's testimony before Congress, the Workplace Accountability and Worker Advocacy Act was signed into law. It wasn't everything advocates had wanted, but it was substantial. Wage protections tightened, third-party audits mandated, whistleblower protections strengthened. A national fund established to support workers in hospitality, agriculture, and domestic service. The night the bill passed, Ghost called Keisha. "Turn on C-SPAN," he said. The president stood at a podium in the Rose Garden, signing the legislation into law. He spoke about workers' rights, about the importance of standing against exploitation, about the bravery it takes to speak truth. And then, surprising everyone, he acknowledged the iron promises by name. This legislation exists because one woman was courageous enough to stand alone against corruption, and because a motorcycle club understood that standing with the voiceless is what loyalty means. I want to acknowledge Marcus Ghost Rivera and the Iron Promises Motorcycle Club for reminding this nation that community, solidarity, and witness can change the world. Ghost watched the screen from the clubhouse, surrounded by his crew. Lucia hugged him. Dane nodded with quiet respect. James documented it for their archives. 2 years after Ashford's conviction, Keisha received a call from Dr. Okafor. Sage was being recognized by the James Beard Foundation as one of the most important restaurants in the country, not just for the excellence of the food, but for the ethics of the operation, the treatment of staff, the commitment to justice. When Keisha walked into the Beard Award ceremony, Ghost was waiting in the lobby. He wore a suit instead of his kuta, but his presence was unchanged, substantial, steady, true. "You ready?" he asked. "For what?" Keisha asked. "For being seen," he said simply. "You've been changing the world quietly for 2 years. Tonight, the world gets to see what that looks like." Keisha took the stage to accept the award alongside Dr. Okafor. She spoke about justice, about the kitchen as a space where dignity could be protected, about the responsibility that comes with leadership, and she spoke about Ghost. There's a person in this room, actually, several people, who understood something important. They understood that one person standing for what's right shouldn't have to stand alone. That courage requires witness. That solidarity is a form of power that no amount of money can purchase or corrupt. I want to acknowledge them. I want to acknowledge that this recognition belongs not just to me, but to everyone who believed that standing with the voiceless was worth riding for. Ghost stood. So did Lucia, Dane, James, and a dozen other iron promises in the audience. It was a gesture, a moment, but it carried weight. It said, "This matters, community matters, loyalty matters." 5 years after the original confrontation with Ashford, Voices Heard had grown into a national organization with chapters in 12 states and a staff of 42 people. Keisha was the executive director, working full-time to protect hospitality workers, to document exploitation, to build systems of accountability. Ghost remained involved, but in a different capacity now. He'd handed the day-to-day leadership of the Iron Promises to Dane, focusing his energy on Voices Heard's advisory board. He was still the moral compass, the person who reminded everyone what the promise meant. One evening, Keisha organized a dinner at her new restaurant, The Promise, named deliberately, located in the Riverside neighborhood where her journey had begun. Ghost was the first person to sit at the chef's counter. She prepared a meal that told a story. The roots of her journey, the growth she'd experienced, the future she was building. Each course was a chapter. Vulnerability, courage, alliance, transformation, legacy. When Ghost finished eating, he looked at her with the kind of respect that's been earned through time and consistent action. "You've become what I hoped you'd become," he said. "Not just a person who stood. A person who builds systems so others don't have to stand alone." "I learned from you," Keisha said simply. "No," Ghost corrected gently. "You learned what you already knew. I just made sure you weren't standing alone while you learned it. That's different." He pulled out an old photograph, the image from that first day, 73 bikers assembled in the parking lot of Riverside Apartments. He'd had it framed. "This is the day the world saw what loyalty means," Ghost said. "Not violence, not revenge, just community showing up and saying, 'We see you. Your courage matters. You're not alone. I want you to keep this. I want you to remember, you stood first.' We showed up because standing alone is the hardest thing a person can do." Keisha took the photograph with both hands, understanding its weight, not the physical weight, but the weight of meaning. The weight of promises kept across years and systems and lives. She hung it in the office of The Promise, and then in the headquarters of Voices Heard, and finally in a museum exhibit about workers' rights. That image, 73 bikers, one black woman, one moment of absolute clarity about what solidarity means, became an icon of a movement. Years passed, laws changed, systems evolved. But the story remained constant. One woman stood. 73 bikers answered. The world watched and learned that courage creates community, creates change. Ghost grew older, but the promise didn't fade. It became part of how people understood loyalty. It became part of how bikers saw themselves. It became proof that standing with the voiceless isn't just an act of charity. It's an act of power. When Ghost passed away at 78, the Iron Promises held a service with over 1,000 bikers from across the country. Keisha spoke, her voice steady, her gratitude absolute. "He didn't rescue me," Keisha said from the podium. "He witnessed me. He believed that one woman's courage deserved to be amplified, not hidden. He showed that loyalty means riding for people who stand for what's right. He changed my life by refusing to let me stand alone." The legacy lived on, in The Promise, in Voices Heard, in the laws that now protected workers, in the thousands of people who understood that being seen, being witnessed, being stood for, was the beginning of change. One black woman, 73 bikers, one promise. That was enough. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and share this story with someone who needs to know you never stand alone. We ride for each other. See you in the next chapter.